talk about the county's comprehensive planning process. And we've got set aside to go to 3 o'clock today. And we've all got the agenda here. So, Avril, who's going to kick us off?
You can go ahead and speak now, if you would use.
Is the mic not on?
It's on.
It is on. Okay, well, great. So we're going to start off with the status update on public engagement and plan drafting. So thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So, hi everyone, great to be here with you in person. Let me know if you're not picking me up on the mic. For those of you who haven't met me before in person, I'm Leanne King with Clearing Associates. We're assisting with the development of comprehensive plan. So I'll just go ahead and jump into a little bit of an update on where we are with the comprehensive planning process. This is a 4-phase process, and we are kind of rounding out phase 3 of the process, or about 3/4 of the way through. We have completed the first 2 rounds of engagement and have been working through a working draft of the plan itself. And we'll talk about some of those aspects here in a little bit more detail in just a moment. Again, we have been working with the steering committee that you all appointed. It's been very wonderful to work with them, and it's been a great process thus far, getting engagement from the community to help support development of this plan. So in terms of the public engagement updates, the second, what we call community engagement window, that's the CEW number 2, Develop Policy Directions and Priorities, that took course over this summer, began in June and ended just not that long ago. September 22nd was the last event. There were 16 intercept events, 6 information tables at festivals, and 14 community markets that were the questions, the surveys were made available. About a little over 2,600 people participated in this phase, and 60% of those folks were actually folks that didn't participate in the first round. So we got a lot of new inputs through this second phase of engagement. And that totals 2,800, a little more than that, unique participants for the project overall as a whole. And those are very, very good numbers in terms of kind of what we see when we look across the nation in terms of public engagement for comprehensive planning processes. So the next phase, there is one more kind of formal round before the public adoption hearing phase, which is the community engagement window number 3, which we call Affirm the Plan. That will be a public unveiling of the plan. Folks in the community will have a chance to actually review the plan in a working draft phase and provide their inputs, and then we will take that input and make final revisions to the plan before it goes into the adoption phase. So in terms of the 4th round of engagement, what we're proposing is that we would have a roving exhibit of the draft plan, kind of think of a kiosk that could move around the community in various ways. There would also be public intercept events to be able to hopefully capture some additional folks that haven't had a chance to participate in this process. So there'd be about 5 to 8 of those public intercept events to make it available to folks. And throughout that time, it would be online. The vast majority of the inputs that we're getting are through online engagement, and so we want to make sure that that continues to be an opportunity. And in addition to that, a way to engage students, there's going to be a program offered during schools the last week of October for National Community Planning Month to kind of celebrate the work that you all are doing as part of that national month. Just kind of a quick overview of where we are in terms of the working draft of the plan. So June through July, the plan framework, that's kind of the core components of the plan, were drafted by the project team using all the inputs we've received from stakeholder interviews and from stakeholder organization survey inputs and from the public input we received from the community. And then July through September, we shared those drafts with the steering committee, got their feedback, and made revisions to the drafts. This month is the Board of Commissioner review month, giving you all a chance to take a look at, again, the working draft of the plan. It's very much kind of in its simplest form, so to speak, right now. It's not even a fully packaged plan at this point, but looking at kind of the core components of it. And then September through October, your technical advisory committee will be having a chance to take a look at the working draft of the plan as well. So any questions or feedback on the engagement or process? Okay, move through. Oh, go ahead. Sure.
Maybe I missed it, the planning boards?
So So planning board will be involved in this process, and actually on the next step slide, we do have a component for them to be involved in this process, so that they are definitely going to be briefed on the plan and some of the core components of the plan moving forward. Pardon?
Kind of simultaneously to the rest of this.
Yeah, I think it will this is the kind of internal vetting, so to speak, and then it will make its way to them for review as well. Yeah. Okay. Okay, key policy considerations. So, there are a lot of different issues that we're dealing with within the comprehensive plan, but some of the issues kind of rise to the top in terms of their kind of significance in the community and how important they are to get them right. And we understand that there were 4 specific issues it was important to kind of have further discussion on. Those are the ones listed here on the screen: conditional zoning, density, infrastructure, and affordable housing. And for each of these, we've got a little bit of background information about these key policy considerations, and then some information about the working draft of what the plan includes. Just to kind of, as a reminder of kind of what our current stage is with respect to addressing these different policy consideration topics. So we'll go through one by one. I can share the background information, the current working draft of how we're addressing these from a policies and actions standpoint, and then feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions, of course, but we will have kind of a pause after each to have whatever dialogue you'd like to have about those. So feel free to, again, stop me as needed. So we'll dive into conditional zoning first. This is a tool allowed, it's authorized by our North Carolina General Assembly. It's part of our state statutes. It's defined as a legislative zoning map amendment with site-specific conditions incorporated into the zoning map amendment. This would be a new tool if it were enacted by the county. Just a little bit of information about the purpose and intent of the tool. Conditional zoning is a voluntary development regulation tool that's authorized by the state statutes. And voluntary is underlined there because it's really important to know that this has to be something that a willing property owner enters into. It's not something the county, does on its own. Conditional zoning districts can include standards that are specific to a property that address the concerns of the neighbors, the government, and also, the property owner themselves. The conditions within the conditional zoning district must be agreed to in writing by the landowner or applicant and the local government. So it's an agreement of sorts that's worked through. An approval is a legislative decision. So unlike a special use permit, a conditional zoning approval is enacted by the county commission and can include the full range of public input. So it's a different process for approval than your special use permits go through. Just a little bit about what it can do. It can, a lot of local governments in the state use conditional zoning to do a number of different things. One is to actually restrict allowable uses. So in a base zoning district, there's a broad range of different uses that can be developed under that zoning category. Conditional zoning, you can actually restrict it and only have a more limited number of uses. It's also possible to expand that list. It could go both ways if you wanted to. It would just, again, have to be agreed upon by both the applicant and the county government. You can modify development standards. So think about setbacks, buffer width, open space, any kind of development standard within your code can be modified through that process. You can include development plan commitments, such as locations of roads or buildings. You can have some kind of more specificity in terms of where certain things might go in that project. You can include commitments regarding the construction of public infrastructure. And there are other conditions, such as the development of affordable housing, that can become part of that zoning district. So that kind of concludes the overview of the tool itself. Just a little bit about what's in the plan that's kind of connected to this idea of conditional zoning. From a policy standpoint, these policies are high level, and I think that conditional zoning could be very much argued to be supportive of the 4 that are listed here. Guiding land use decisions to incorporate the Growth Protection Conservation Framework Map, promoting the development and enhancement of communities and identified growth areas, promoting sustainable and resilient development, and supporting development on infill, redevelopment, and adaptive reuse sites. So conditional zoning could be, used and leveraged to be supportive of all those policies. But more specifically, in terms of the working draft of the plan, the actions that kind of touch on conditional zoning that are the three listed here. And we've got, because they were kind of lengthy, you'll see the ellipses in these excerpts. So the first is considering the development and adoption of conditional zoning, basically taking it on as a new tool that the county can use that can result in development approaches tailored to support site conditions, site context, and the goals and policies of the plan. The second one is in tandem with conditional zoning option, the county should formalize an exactions table matrix to mitigate development impacts as well as assure the county goals are fulfilled. That second one is really to say this is kind of the framework that we want to use in thinking about the types of exactions that we might want to ask for as part of a conditional zoning process. So there's some guidance for the county to be having those discussions on a case-by-case basis. And then the third bullet here is to consider conditional zoning as an approach to work with landowners to acquire greenway easements, develop recreation facilities with new developments, and encourage public-private partnerships for recreation projects. So again, that's a more kind of specific way that that tool can be leveraged. That was in, I believe, the health and recreation chapter as an action item for consideration. And I believe that's our last slide. Yeah, so happy to take any questions or comments that you have on these.
So one question. So you said to sort of set these standards or these metrics with this, can we go back to the slide, please?
Yeah, is it this one here that has the type?
The last one.
Oh, the very last
Not
slide?
the picture, but the one before it.
Yes, so that
Yeah.
second bullet is the one that talks about the
Yeah.
exactions table matrix.
The exactions table.
Mhm.
So, but you said on a case-by-case basis, but really kind of this sets up a set of like standardized metrics, right? So that you would kind of consistently apply, like here's the metrics, and for developers or property owners who kind of meet these specifications for things they're willing to do, it sets up this clear expectation that if you do these things, here's the path forward for your project, so that we don't get into a situation where we're sort of like, with each project differently negotiating over the set of issues that we have like an interest in. Am I thinking about that the right way?
So I think the idea behind the second bullet, and feel free to jump in if you want to, Nate, I think the idea here is that you would provide a framework that you would be using to guide decision-making regarding to any exactions that the county would want to include as part of a conditional zoning. So yes, so I think that there would be consistency in terms of like what could potentially be asked for in an individual project.
Okay.
But still, maybe on a case-by-case basis, like whoever's reviewing the application could consider adding things to it. Not that that's an ideal situation, but it would still be allowed on a case-by-case basis for us to say, or to tell the applicant, like, we want you to do X or Y as well.
And I think there would probably be, maybe to some degree, it depends on how you set up and set out the specifics in your ordinance versus maybe how other local governments have done it,
So I think it's a tiered approach. I think we're talking about, we haven't really discussed what would be reviewed at a staff level and what the expectations are. I think we're just talking more broadly at this point about what the flexibility that's afforded to you in a conditional zoning decision. Because it's site-specific plan, there will be some flexibility, but we need to outline what the exactions are. The best way to think about exactions are they are uniquely and specifically attributable to the development. So when an applicant, and it's fine to go ahead, we will set standards and provide those to you all about what constitutes a staff level review, what constitutes a Board of Adjustment review through a special use permit, versus what constitutes a conditional zoning request. What we need to discuss are what are our expectations, whether that be affordable units, providing a greenway easement when it's identified in a plan and we know that that comes across a property, traffic improvements on site, sidewalks, things of that nature. But we haven't gotten to the specifics of what the triggers are for the individual reviews themselves.
So I have just kind of a broader question. So can you just walk us through basically kind of the difference of how this is going to be compared to how we do it now?
Mhm.
If we went this way, walk us through that, and then also some pros and cons of the different ways would be useful just for that context.
I can definitely do that.
Thank you.
So the way we do it now, the applications, I'll start with the applications that come to you all. Right now, you are legislative, policy-driven. You look at text amendments. Those are the ones where we change the code. You also look at map amendments. Those are rezonings, where you simply change the zoning district. You do not review any development. All of the development review falls into two different buckets. One, those that meet the threshold for a staff level review, and we do those every day, thousands of them. Then, defined in our code is what's called the permitted use table. If you see a P in that column, it means it's permitted. You go through a staff level review. If you see an S, that means it's a special use permit that goes to our Board of Adjustment through a quasi judicial review. This represents a sea change. This is something you've never done before, will require a lot of code revisions, but it does give you the flexibility to have a conversation with a developer that's proposing a project to see some of the things that you have identified as important to you and the community. As part of that, it's a negotiation. The developer has to agree to whatever you lay out. And that's why I think it's so important for us to be clear as to what our expectations are, so there's predictability and people know what they're up against.
So it provides some flexibility in thinking about the project, and it also provides an opportunity to have a more focused discussion about how you can go about implementing some of the, ideas that are included in this plan and other community plans. In kind of like you said, a negotiated situation with the plan.
Is the city's downtown hotel ordinance a conditional zoning approach, or is that a conditional use zoning approach?
No, they primarily review all applications through the conditional zoning tool. I think we need to be really careful with how we utilize conditional zoning as a county. The city also has very complicated sort of zoning districts that are associated with downtown specifically because they adopted a downtown master plan, and it has its own inherent set of circumstances. They also have form-based codes, but they're also very much largely, the conditions are very different than what we're facing. Sure, we have some urban areas, but not to the extent that they have downtown.
Yeah, but we have some common, I think when we think about large-scale development across the county, I think particularly when it's has residential components to it, right? We're concerned about, first, not developing dense developments in the wrong places on steep slopes, but for the developments that are gonna happen, I think people wanna see, hey, can we get some affordability out of this? Can we incorporate more green building into these projects than it's just required? And these are things we can't mandate, but we would wanna encourage more of those outcomes, right? And so, what I'm hoping we will avoid is we don't want to be in some kind of protracted negotiation over every single project that comes in front of us, and we don't want to treat people we want to treat people fairly and consistently. So that's kind of what I'm sort of asking is can we create a set of metrics where it's if you do these things, then you should be clear. Your project will be approved if you incorporate these things into it, assuming it meets all other zoning standards.
Let me give you kind of an example to help with that.
Yeah.
So you're already going to have, the staff will prepare a professional staff report that will include a recommendation. The big sea change too is you're not only looking at just a rezoning request to rezone a property from say R3 to commercial service. Now you're looking at a site-specific plan. we will have already vetted the things that we would want to see through our exactions to make sure that those are included in the plan. Part of the negotiation comes on the unique circumstances associated with each parcel, because we know every parcel in the county, there's no two parcels that are kind of created equally. You might have a stream on this parcel. You might have topography on this other parcel. So what typically happens through a conditional zoning, and by the way, your planning board will review these as well and provide a recommendation. So that has to happen. But what you might see is, hey, you know, we've got this steep topography in the back. We're really trying to cluster development. We could use some relief on a required setback. So that's kind of the uniqueness of every application. Staff will review that request, and we will provide a professional recommendation to you all as well, so you don't feel like that you're negotiating in real time up on the dais. But sometimes that does happen where people can offer friendly amendments. You know, as commissioners, you can do that. Sometimes I've seen that happen in public hearings. And just remember, it can be done, but the developer has to agree to any kind of amendment that's made in real time as well. So maybe they offer a percent of affordable housing, but it's in an area where someone makes an amendment to include 5 additional affordable units. Those kind of things happen. But you will have sort of it pre-reviewed by both staff and the planning board before it even gets to you.
And we can also set a threshold as to which ones specifically come to us.
That's my recommendation.
Okay. Because obviously, some of those really long Board of Adjustment meetings, I mean, that, we could be setting ourselves up for that kind of situation as well.
The other thing to keep in mind too, the differences between the Board of Adjustment and this process. During a legislative process, you can have numerous subjective comments, numerous opinion-based testimony, whereas the Board of Adjustment is very expert testimony. So just know that that's also part of the process, and you will also have numerous public comments that don't represent just expert opinion. So you color outside of the edges as part of this process.
I like that analogy.
So,
I had several questions. So go ahead,
No,
Go ahead.
I think what Amanda was getting to, and what Ronnie was getting to is that list. Can we come up with that metrics that would say, we want 10% of every development over 200 units to be affordable? That's what they're trying to drive to.
Yes.
When do we have that conversation and where?
And yeah, I think that's well said. And is that in the comp plan, or is the comp plan just sort of like laying out the concepts, and then we
We're-
will answer those questions?
That's correct.
Once the
We'll
comp
have
plan
the
is-
foundation of what we want, and then we'll fine tune it as part of the text amendments that then get memorialized in the zoning ordinance itself.
Question I have, when we look at the conditional zoning, and a good example is when you say if we set aside 10% for affordable housing, 20% or whatever. After we get into this, how difficult is it to change it? Say if we want to say, well, it's not getting where we want to go, or we have some where we require 30%, whatever. How do we go about that?
Great question. And as part of a comprehensive plan, what you always do is audit yourself. So you actually are able to, once the comprehensive plan is adopted and you all decide, hey, this is working, this is not working, we can do check-ins and we can make additional text amendments. That can happen fairly quickly.
So Nate, are there counties our size or larger that use conditional zoning in the state?
There are a lot more cities that do it, but there are plenty of counties, New Hanover, I believe Orange,
Yeah.
Leanne knows.
Yeah, I think more than half of the state, local governments have conditional zoning. And actually, within the past, I forget what the school of government had some statistics about this, but in the last decade or so, the vast majority of rezoning approvals have been through conditional zoning processes. So it's a tool that a lot of communities are using.
And are any of them set up to where there's exactions for smaller size development that can be reviewed and approved
Yeah,
despite the legislative nature.
that's where we had to be ultra clear, because as a staff, whatever you pass, I have to police.
Okay.
Okay, but just, that was my same question, I just want to make sure I'm clear on the answer. We could, conditional zoning projects that go through the conditional zoning process can be approved at the staff level depending on the scale of the project and the thresholds that we set, or by definition, do they end up at our desk at the end of the day?
So what we would do is we'd take the permitted use table and we would alter it. The Ps, the permitted use, remains with staff. The special use remains with the Board of Adjustment. We put a CZ for any of the uses that we want to send to you all for a review, and we are clear about a threshold. So let's throw out an example. You all might say, hey, planning staff, we would feel comfortable reviewing a project that has 400 multifamily units. And then what we would do is we would work backward from that, and it might be something like the Board of Adjustment reviews projects of, 200 or above, or you can set the thresholds wherever you want. We just has to be clear about the boundary of what staff reviews versus what the Board of Adjustment reviews versus what you all review. We're not there yet.
And kind of staying on this point, so like on the downtown hotel policy, like my understanding is like hotel projects have to go to the city council for review, but if they meet certain city-defined objectives in the project, then only much, much larger projects have to go to city council. Otherwise, they are approved as a use by right at the staff, or maybe there's some like downtown, maybe there's a few other things, but it doesn't go to city council. So similar kinds of mechanisms could be built here. Because I think that's a powerful tool, right? Like if we go down this path, like we're not gonna wanna review a high percentage of the projects that we're a big county, there's a lot of growth, like we don't have the bandwidth to review a high percentage of the projects, and people don't wanna come to us because now it's a politicized process, so if we can clearly define like, hey, here's the outcomes we routinely wanna see. We wanna see them in most projects, right? So if you put these things, some green building elements, some degrees of affordability, then you don't have to come to the county commission. But if you don't, you're going to the county commission. I mean, that's kind of the probably oversimplified way that I'm thinking about this, but is that,
That's
yeah?
pretty good. You can use the community-oriented development as an example. It includes a menu of things we'd like to see that represent good design and good planning and affordability. We could grow that, and you basically have a choice. You can either adhere to this, or you can head on to the commissioners for a conditional zoning, and there's no guarantee.
Yeah.
You will review about the merits of the project.
So here's, I think, another example would be, let's say it's a storage unit facility being proposed.
Self-storage.
Self-storage. In theory, we apply conditional zoning to it, but it's not coming before this board. It could go through staff, through administrative process. Is that?
No, staff would not review, ultimately, you all have to be the approvers of a conditional zoning request. So that's where we have to be clear about setting those thresholds for what we review versus what the Board of Adjustment reviews versus what you review.
So
But-
regardless of size, regardless of the land use, the application has to come on our agenda.
Planning
If it's a
board.
conditional zoning district, yes.
Right.
It's conditional.
Now, we will still provide the professional evaluation through a staff report. So you have the ability to review that as well.
So can I say this in layman's terms?
Yeah.
So I think what Nate was saying, and Nate, make sure I'm saying this right. So from a layman's terms, if it's permitted use for that property, it can go to staff. So the P that he was talking about is permitted. So to Brownie's term, permitted by right. That's what we can see. But if they don't do those pieces and put what we want there, they can choose to go the conditional zoning route, which has to come to you. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, and I
Right.
just received a note that's helpful. So, staff, it's an administrative decision. Staff can evaluate whether the defined elements are met, and we have no discretion. Either meet the ordinance or you don't meet the ordinance. Quasi judicial, the Board of Adjustment. are the conditions met? And 3, legislative, conditional zoning and standard rezoning. Planning board as your recommending body, you are the ultimate approvers.
I guess my final thought, and I don't want to throw us off topic too much, but could you help outline the Venn diagram of form-based codes as it relates to conditional?
Sure. So form-based codes are a unique animal, and you really need a form first. So let's use like Haywood Road in the city as an example. It is very hard in some areas of the county to define what the form is. Our recommendation is you start with your small area plans and some of our more identifiable areas, and you go from there. The beauty is with a small area plan, you can set design guidelines and not have to adopt a form-based code. But form-based codes, they have a lot of restrictions, and they can be somewhat tricky to work with. I have not had any experience, and Leanne may be able to tell you some examples of more urban counties that have form-based codes, but I'm only familiar with form-based codes in cities.
I would say I'd say that's pretty accurate. I can think of maybe one in Virginia where they don't have municipalities within counties. That's a very urbanizing county that has some form-based code districts. The other thing I would say is the vast majority of communities don't have true form-based codes. They have hybrids that actually also regulates land use as well, not just strictly form. It's usually a hybrid of both of those in most cases.
Did you have something in particular, Commissioner Sloan, that you were kind of tossing around in your
I guess
mind?
I'm trying to think of what tools we need to solve which of our problems, right? And so, I see form-based codes as a way to like impose design standards and push the built environment in a certain direction that we want. And I guess I've always seen conditional zoning as a way to actually hold developers accountable and provide something back to the community.
Sure.
But maybe what I'm hearing you say is it's our only tool to do.
So I think a combination of conditional zoning and small area plans might get us there. Conditional zoning is going to be case by case, one parcel at a time, whereas a small area plan is going to define the area and then allow the community to have some input in terms of what they might want to see. For example, one small area you might define might have a proliferation of metal buildings. They don't want to see metal buildings anymore. They might want to have some brick veneer or some other standards that help sort of preserve a form. Or, we don't have incorporated municipalities other than ones that are already defined in the county, but we do have a lot of areas that feel like it's a place name, but they're starting to take form. So I think that we have proposed some tools that would get to the heart and soul of what you're trying to accomplish.
And an important thing to remember too is that conditional zoning is by petition of the applicant. So that's kind of another important piece to that as well. It's very voluntary based.
So you say that about 50% of local governments within North Carolina, I think you said, are using conditional zoning?
I
or-
believe that is accurate. School of Government has some, you've got it pulled up.
Okay.
This is from, they did the survey in 2018 and published the report in 2020. 54% of responding jurisdictions reported that they had adopted conditional zoning. And then it goes on, more common for more populous jurisdictions, notably in cities with high population, while only 33% of the cities with populations under 1,000 reported any use of conditional zoning. 77% of the cities with population over 25,000 did so.
As development gets more complex and you have kind of the harder sites to deal with and more kind of issues that you're dealing with as a community, it becomes a more helpful tool.
So
Sorry.
I was just gonna ask them with that, so we have some experience across North Carolina with that. So I'm wondering from the staff perspective that talking about this as a tool, the pros and cons of this as a tool, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that perspective since it has been utilized.
So I've actually worked in communities with conditional zoning, and I've reviewed conditional zoning applications. They can be pros. It's customizable. It addresses site-specific constraints. I would say that I would maintain and preserve two forms of rezoning request. I would keep the standard rezonings, because sometimes those are helpful when staff, we might look at an area that probably needs to be a staff-initiated rezoning, but we wouldn't want to put a lot of conditions on ourselves based on what a particular plan might say. The cons to conditional zoning sometimes are they can be fairly cumbersome. Since it's legislative, you are often met with a lot of opinion and subjective evidence, and you have to sort of muddle through a decision, and that's why it's so important for you to have the staff analysis. One of the things I can offer that's very helpful is I've worked in a community that offers pros and cons in the staff report for each site. And that would be, I think that's one of the most important contributions that staff can provide you all that helps you with the decision, since it's so site-specific. The other con to conditional zoning is we have to be very careful, and we want to give staff some flexibility, because what often happens with every application is, wow, I didn't realize that old sewer line was there, or wow, I didn't realize that buried underground storage tank. There's always changes and revisions. So rather than have to come back to you all, we'll have to set some thresholds as to what staff can work with as well.
There's also, again, you might have an opinion about it, kind of the community engagement around conditional zonings, which some might say is a pro and some might say is a con.
It's true. One of the things that we've done already is we've altered our special use permit applications to strongly recommend a community meeting be held. Those can be super effective and help melt away some of the divisions and some of the concerns. We had an application recently that went through the Board of Adjustment that held a community meeting, and they worked out some of their own issues. They added some fencing. They added some additional buffering. They changed sort of the layout of the project. So I think that as part of the conditional zoning recommendation is that we ingrain in the code that folks actually have a community meeting.
Let me ask this. So right now, basically all of our development, large-scale development, goes through the zoning board of adjustment, through that quasi-judicial process, which is extremely transparent and fair. It's also mind-numbingly frustrating for the average person to watch and interact with for the first time, maybe the second time. But so I guess this would be a big sea change, no matter how we apply it, I think, in our codes. I guess I'm just wondering, Nate and Jillian too, like, what problem of Buncombe County do you think this might solve? Is it just creating a relationship with the development community where we've never had one, or is it simply our legal ability to apply conditions, or like what I guess what excites you about it? What would be your hope?
So I'd say what excites me the most is it's additional flexibility. We're finally getting to the point where we decide what, based on the fact that we're urbanizing and we're growing and things have changed. 2 extraterritorial jurisdictions are no longer with us. We have issues related to pieces and parts of sidewalks that are unconnected. We have urban levels of service. We have rural levels of service, depending on where you are in the county. I think this gives you the additional support that's needed to provide an additional application. There are many times where staff takes before an application to the Board of Adjustment, and we've said, wow, geez, wouldn't this be kind of nice if we were able to take a particular project down a different route? And that's what I would say to that is we're outgrowing our code. It's the little engine that could, essentially. And I think that we're at a time where we're gonna need some additional options. I think there's plenty of people out in the community as well that don't like quasi judicial process. So I think having a mix provides those opportunities that just aren't there now. Right, that's a great point. You actually get the site plan in front of you. So whereas before, I tell you when I bring a rezoning, you may not consider a site plan.
Yeah,
Now you can.
And if, and a project that goes through conditional zoning, at the end of that process, assuming a proposal is approved, that plan actually becomes the distinct zoning that exists for that property. So it's no
Correct.
longer zone R2, R3. It's like, it's zoned, that plan is the specific zoning for that area of land in perpetuity unless the county commission changes it in the future.
Correct.
It's an overlay in essence.
Yeah.
You put a CZ designation after whatever district you zone it to, and that site-specific plan becomes the law of the land on that property.
And to your previous question, you know, I think a lot of applicants like this opportunity because as you start to deal with kind of some challenging conditions, it's an opportunity to have a more specific discussion about that property as opposed to kind of a vast zoning district that would be applied under kind of a traditional zoning. And a lot of applicants are willing to kind of make some adjustments or add some things to the project to be able to get it approved. And so I think that it just allows for a dialogue and a kind of a focused dialogue on that specific project that a traditional rezoning doesn't necessarily allow for. And again, it's by, you know, it's volunteer, so they petition to do it.
We're not gonna consider doing a conditional use zoning process that would result in those projects coming to the county commissioners, but only to the Board of Adjustments.
Right, 160D, those are the omnibus changes that we recently approved. It basically gives you, there used to be this very cumbersome process called a conditional use rezoning. All we have now are conditional zoning, special use permits, standard rezonings.
Okay. Good. All right, other questions on conditional zoning or other things that we need to be thinking through on this point?
Not on this topic.
All right, should we
Okay.
keep going?
All right.
I just have one
Go
just
ahead.
quick question. If we were to proceed with this, what timeline can you envision for implementation? It's okay if we come back to that later.
Well, there could be potentially, you know, other ordinance adjustments that you may want to make in addition to adding this if you choose to go in that direction. So I guess one thing to consider is whether you want to do those as a package of
Right.
ordinance updates, or some communities will do that, but maybe do some kind of focused, shorter term updates first, and then kind of
Got it.
do the package later. So there are different alternatives.
My suggestion would be see everything we have to offer today, and then maybe we can set some priorities as to which package you'd like to prioritize. And we can do those in that order. So,
All right, so next topic, density. So I'm going to talk a little bit first here about kind of the unique kind of situation that you have in Buncombe County, which maybe isn't so unique in western North Carolina, but I think it is unique across the state, in that you have significant development constraints within the county in terms of places that you can actually develop. So this is a map from your 2013 plan that has, you know, high and moderate hazard areas, steep slope, elevations over 2,500 square feet, 2,500 feet. There might be some other, one or two others on here that I can't see from this distance, but, you know, those are the kind of darker orangey and yellowy areas on the map, which is a significant portion of the county in terms of where future development could be accommodated. So we did some analysis as part of this planning project, looking at what we call potentially developable areas by jurisdiction. I want to just note that potentially developable areas does not include kind of any direct discussions with landowners. These are places that don't have any kind of improvements on them today, and could potentially, you know, they have the right to be developed, so to speak. But again, each property owner may not be actually willing or interested in doing that. But from kind of that top-level analysis, what we identified is that the majority of the potentially developable lands in the county are within the county's jurisdiction. You see that county jurisdiction at the percent of total acreage, over 88%. In addition to that 88%, we separated out the parcels that are within 2,500 square feet of municipal jurisdiction, where you would probably see growth pressure and interest earlier than maybe some of the outer reaching areas, and there's almost additional 7% of land that's potentially developable within the county's jurisdiction. So the actual kind of potentially developable lands, according to the analysis that we did, is less than 5% in the municipality. So that's all to say that the county's kind of in a unique position in terms of lands that could be developed in the future, and thinking about how those lands change over time. And this is just a couple of maps to kind of show how this plays out. So these are the kind of the lightest gray that you see out across the county. Those are the PDAs in the county's jurisdiction. The potentially developable areas within 2,500 feet of the municipality, and then the darker ones are actually kind of underneath the municipal layers there.
So we're talking literally vacant, like not even a single family home?
Unimproved.
Okay.
Yeah,
So zero
unimproved.
property.
Yeah, zero, there's zero kind of improved value was the analysis that was used to identify. So then in looking at the majority of lands in the county's jurisdiction that have constraints on them, so looking back at those constraints that we were looking at on that first map, there's a significant percentage of lands that have constraints on them. And so, only about 22% don't have constraints. The rest have floodplain constraints, steep slope, protected ridge lines, et cetera. So it's important to think about the fact that, of the land that could be developed within the county, actually a very small portion of it is truly developable when you kind of separate out and kind of subtract out all of those constraints that probably already have regulations in place today to kind of, restrict or prohibit that growth in some way. So, that kind of paints a picture, the land that you have that's developable, it's very important to kind of use it in a way that's really supportive of the plan's direction and what we're trying to, Duncan's trying to achieve as a community and thinking about land use. So this is just that map that identifies those areas. So the darkest areas are the places that do not have as many constraints on them. And you can kind of see the legend there. So in thinking about kind of how we go about, in addition to that, another piece to this, which Nate alluded to earlier, is the fact that a number of years ago, the state legislature took away the ability for the city of Asheville and town of Weaverville to have extraterritorial jurisdiction authority outside of their corporate limits, which allowed them planning and zoning authority on lands that were, essentially adjacent and potentially going to be annexed in the future and become part of their community. That planning tool is no longer available to them, but that's not to say that the pattern and fabric of that municipal growth had not started to happen within those areas. And so the county now has jurisdiction over lands that were kind of initially planned for as being municipal in the long term. And so having to kind of think and plan for, from a county standpoint, how do we kind of manage those lands over time? Because they may or may not become municipal in the future, but those patterns exist regardless. And kind of the, continuation of those municipal kind of development patterns are important to be considering. So in terms of the working draft of the comprehensive plan, we do, one of the new things that's going to come out of this comprehensive plan is essentially what most communities call a future land use map. That is a policy guide. It's not regulatory, it's not a law, but it's a policy guide that can be used by staff, planning board, the commission, to review different projects and think about what's appropriate given the guidance that's on this map and the supporting categories. And so in each of those, there are, again, working draft, some specific densities that are recommended for those different categories based on whether it's a kind of public land, a rural community, maybe a place that's within a growth area that we want to be supporting more development to be occurring. Maybe it's within a growth area where we want to really be supporting kind of a higher density type of situation, given the location and kind of access to services and maybe proximity to a municipality as well. So you can see there's a variety of different kind of densities listed across this, from very low density, again, that you would, that are kind of recommended for the lower kind of density rural areas, to more higher density in places that we want to be kind of taking advantage of growth potential, given the fact that there are such kind of limited opportunities within the county. And one thing that's really important to think about, density, it can be a very polarizing topic in a lot of communities, and thinking particularly about high density and what high density looks like and where it goes. And I think talking about density as a number without having associated kind of illustrations of what that can look like can really kind of make for a challenging situation, because not all density is created equal. You can have really poorly designed high-density projects, and you can have really well-designed high-density projects. And so we've got, I think the importance is kind of thinking about the standards that are applied to particularly higher density projects to help manage growth as it occurs over time. And some people might think, you know, some of the numbers that we're showing on the screen, you know, that we're talking about like, you know, major kind of major developments that you would find in a big city or something like that. But I think what you'll see in some of the illustrations that we've got here is that, again, density is really about how you plan and design it. Just a quick note, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Carborough, North Carolina. That's where I live right now. It's right beside Chapel Hill. Carborough had the distinction for many, many years of being the most dense city in the entire state of North Carolina. I don't think that there's a single building over 3 stories tall within that community. Charlotte outpaced them. Charlotte's like beyond them now. And that's per capita looking over the, you know, the full area. But I think it's important kind of illustration that you can have what we call gentle density that is really powerful and makes a big difference without it being kind of an overpowering, more urban type environment. So some density examples here. This is, I think all of our examples are actually from different communities in Washington State. There's a really great resource that you can see there at the Bottom Municipal Research and Services Center at Washington that's got some really great resources to kind of look at what density looks like. So this is a 9.3 dwelling units per acre project. Traditional kind of streetscape, there's common open space. It has a mix of single family duplexes and triplexes, and it's in Issaquah, Washington. Ratcheting up, looking at 15 dwelling units per acre. There's a variety of housing types in this project that's also in Issaquah. It's pedestrian friendly, common space trails. You know, there's a lot of kind of types of amenities that we've talked about in this planning process, wanting to encourage in terms of new development and the way that neighborhoods are built. This is one that's maybe more traditional kind of apartment complex, 18 dwelling units per acre, open space and recreational features, connections to trails, protected natural areas. This one's in Renton, Washington. And then I believe this one is 27 dwelling units per acre, so we are starting to look maybe a little bit more kind of urban scale. Single family and double single family lots were redeveloped to condos. There's 3 to 7 units per building. 30-foot height limitations. So again, you don't necessarily have to go high to have density. It's kind of, and height is, I think, more often than not the kind of the development parameter that most people have the most negative reaction to is really usually the height of the building. And then the kind of highest density example that we have here, this one's from Redmond, Washington, 34 dwelling units per acre, street-oriented mixed-use development. So you've got ground floor retail with dwellings over top and behind. You have common open space, and then the townhouses you can see in kind of the aerial photograph there. So, you know, a variety of different densities, I think all have kind of similar elements in terms of the design, but I think it's important to kind of think about, you know, exactly, not just think about density as a number, but really think about the layout and configuration and some of the dimensional kind of requirements and standards that are applied along with that. So in terms of what's included in the working draft of the plan, we've got a couple of policies promoting the development and enhancement of communities and identified growth areas, and supporting development on infill, redevelopment, and adaptive reuse sites, where places that already have existing development likely already have public services that can be utilized to support redevelopment or reuse. And then in terms of the actions within the plan that are kind of density related, confirming that the zoning ordinance allows for walkable mixed use and higher density development to occur, again, in growth areas, not everywhere. We want it to be occurring in appropriate growth areas within the community. Evaluating regulatory barriers to infill redevelopment and adaptive reuse sites, including looking at parking. These are some of those other ordinance things that you might want to take a look at: parking dimensional requirements, density, access, circulation standards, and providing some flexibility for those to support redevelopment of underutilized sites. And then continuing to develop standards and programs that incentivize affordable housing, cluster development, and green building techniques, more kind of walkable, connected places. And part of being walkable is having something to walk to and having kind of an interesting environment to be walking within, and more compact development supports that in a better way than more dispersed development does. So that's the end of, oh, sorry, I forgot, there was one more slide here. We got a couple more actions. So where water and sewer utilities are available or feasible to implement, looking at changing the ordinance to encourage a variety of housing types and the highest density units per acre. So again, trying to take advantage of those places where growth is really supported by the conditions. The second bullet, developing a voluntary point system as part of the development regulations that can serve as an incentive for sustainable, resilient, and affordable developments. So this would kind of, similar to the kind of conditional zoning, this would be something that a applicant could choose to kind of go with this point system and identify some specific things that they would want to do within their project. And then finally, encouraging small-scale density by crafting a cottage development option to allow for denser residential developments on infill lots as a use by right. I believe, yes, that's the last slide. So happy to take any comments or questions that you have.
Can you pull that slide back up?
The previous,
The last one, yeah.
I think this is the last
Oh,
one.
not the.
Yep.
this
You want to do the
Yes,
one
that
right
thank
before?
you. Yeah, no, the one, I'm sorry, the one you just had up.
Okay.
That one, thank you very much.
I guess unless Jasmine,
Oh,
Gonna
no, I
just-
just was
okay.
reviewing, yeah, go.
my feedback on the bullets here, like around the waiving fees or incentivizing density, I guess where my head's at is just like, in certain areas, we need to not think about allowing density, but
Mhm.
but requiring it or prohibiting low-density strip malls, sprawl, that kind of stuff, however we want to define it. I guess there was a bullet on a previous slide too that said, suggested like we should go through our ordinance and make sure it's allowed. I think it already is generally allowed in most areas.
So your point is that you want to make sure you're getting the right amount of development and kind of not having a site that's underutilized if it's within a growth area.
Yeah. I think we're underutilizing property generally in our community. I think density is like the whole game in my view, because we don't have, land is our biggest constraint and problem. And it's, like in the city of Asheville, like density is generally allowed, not everywhere, but I still don't think it's taken seriously enough there either. So.
Can you speak some more to this cottage development? Explain that some more, please.
So we've talked a lot about, and y'all might have heard, missing middle
Yeah.
housing. Staff doesn't have a lot of flexibility right now. So we have run a 5K, we're now in marathon mode, and the code basically says anything more than 4 principal structures has to be forwarded on to the Board of Adjustment. That's not a whole lot of flexibility when you talk about, say, if someone comes in, Parker, you may want to do a 12-unit cottage development, and within that small compact development on an infill lot, you might have a couple of garage apartments, you might have 3 townhomes. what we would do is create a way to give folks an opportunity based on the things we would want to see in the development, to have the staff review that as of right, so an administrative decision. And then what we need to right-size our density. We need to, currently the maximum density in the county is 12 units an acre. It's probably more appropriate to bump those numbers up in areas that are on a transportation corridor, that are near shopping opportunities, employment opportunities. This is how the community-oriented development program already functions. It allows reductions to things like setbacks. Countywide zoning, of course, did not come about until 2009. So we are really having to adapt this to today's standards very quickly. When those standards were adopted, you had deeper setbacks, and it just doesn't make sense anymore with our limited availability of land that's not constrained, that we really are gonna have to think about innovation. Now, some of those constrained properties, I will tell you, that's where that whole word about clustering takes place. You want to concentrate your development on the least environmentally sensitive portion of a property in order to conserve the more environmentally sensitive portion of the property. So some of these things, we have already pushed the envelope about as far as we can do without doing wholesale changes. This is a preview. And cottage developments, you know, if you can do something administrative and set the standards, it lowers the cost for developers and allows them to do more without having to spend a lot of money on professional drawings and things that drive up the cost overall. That's my simple answer to that, even though it wasn't simple.
Thank you. That helped. I appreciate you showing some examples of various density. I think that's really key because I think you're right. Partly what we hear are concerns. People have certain things in their mind, and the reality is it can be done really well, right? Those examples that you showed us look very inviting in communities that I feel can really fit in well within our community. So I appreciate you showing some of those examples and for us to continue looking at that and thinking about that for the community.
One of the ways you can soften a density conversation as well is to think back in history. So before World War II, we lived more densely. So yes, we still had rural areas, but the cities were denser. After World War II, you started seeing all this suburban growth and then the explosion of single-family development. What we're having to do now is have that conversation because that pattern is no longer sustainable in the area in which we live. We simply don't have the land for it or the infrastructure. So you really have to start thinking about programs that right-size the development and density standards based on the specific location.
That brings me to like the vision I'm trying to establish in my mind about how we not just allow gentle density or middle, but like where and how do we push for it and require it. I don't know of another place like that in the state that's kind of taken that a step further.
So are we able to encourage it through,
Yeah.
through what we're talking about?
Doesn't seem
in a
like
way
the
to-
development community has experience with building this kind of thing.
Well, and part of what you're talking about, Parker, is like in the mixed-use context, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because I mean, like I think the developers do want to, a lot of them will want to build more densely if we make the regulations allow it compared to what they're going to do now. So I think that'll come pretty naturally. But I think you're referring to like commercial developments and integrating, and trying to encourage some more mix of residential in commercial. And there's just a lot of people in the development world are like, you know, I build residential or I build commercial. And some of them love building both, but there's a whole lot who don't, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just, they have a particular business model they're trying to do. So, but mixed uses has a lot of advantages, especially for a community like ours, where if you just do single use, you know, you build some big parking lot that's either empty all day long if it's residential, or it's empty all night long if it's commercial, and we just kind of like, you know, paved over Buncombe County in a really inefficient way. So I think it is an outcome that I think we want to see more of. I also don't know what the right way is to encourage more developers to think about mixed use who might be more kind of single use, focused.
I think we're starting to see the beginnings of some adaptation to our conditions here. I would point out that the Busby development, which is currently in grading operations on Sweeten Creek Road, chose to, through a special use permit process, cluster all their development, and they're actually gonna be, through a conservation easement, preserving a large swath of property. 20 South Bear Creek, which is under development now, we're actually seeing sort of more of a mixed-use model where you're actually seeing senior housing alongside more traditional units, and it actually included some affordable units as well. The Villas of Swananoa is under construction now across from East Haven and Swananoa, yet another example of a successful community-oriented development application. And I think Leanne can probably provide you a couple of examples of other counties that are sort of pushing the envelope.
So I think that one thing to state off the bat is that, I think you are unique across the state in terms of now having former extraterritorial jurisdiction as part of your jurisdiction. There's not a lot of counties that I'm familiar with that have that condition, where there's kind of a, urbanizing, suburbanizing pattern that's now, part of your portfolio of lands that you manage within your jurisdiction. So I think that's important, and so that kind of makes you unique in a lot of ways. I do think that Wake County is maybe an example that's kind of helpful to think about. There are some differences there. I think that the joke that we always made about Wake County is that the planners were trying to work themselves out of a job. They really did want most of the growth to be within the municipalities. I don't think that's necessarily going to play out here, given just kind of how utilities are provided and annexation limitations, et cetera. But I do think that one of the things that they put into place through their planning process and some, ordinance adjustments is this idea of a kind of municipal urban services area, and thinking and working directly with property owners and the adjacent municipality, which I think a lot of the growth areas that we're talking about are kind of those edge areas against the municipalities. Not all of them, but a lot of them are in those locations. And thinking about how do we kind of get the highest and best use out of this? How do we kind of leverage that? I will say, this is not a county, but we've also worked with Cary, North Carolina, and they had some particular areas where they were wanting to make sure that they took the best advantage of those lands, given their kind of access to I-40. It was kind of one of the few large parcels that they had available within their community. So they were starting to have, a lot less land to be developed over time, and so they wanted to kind of make sure they were making the highest and best use of that. And honestly, they would turn down zoning proposals that were for kind of lower intensity projects, and basically say, we're going to wait till it's great. We want something that's going to maximize the potential that's available in this location. So that's another kind of part of that discussion too.
On density, so are we anticipating that like the minimum lot size might be reduced, right? Because I think that actually the county's minimum lot size is actually pretty big. So it seems like there's room to say if you're only going to build one unit, you shouldn't need that much property. I know that we can allow 2 units on a parcel, but there's a lot of times where people don't want to do 2 units because it's I just want to build a house and I'm never going to build another house, right? Because I just need one mortgage, right? So anyway, are we looking at that as one step? It's just a smaller lot size. I think that sounds good. And then I think it is great that we've allowed 2 units per acre, so which means you could build 2 houses or you can build a duplex. But again, in the mountains where property is scarce, it does seem like, there's a lot of places where if you're not going to just do single family, like doing a triplex or a quadruplex, like that may be just, seems like stopping at duplex on a lot of these, smaller or relatively smaller parcels. Probably, we should probably allow more, a lot of people used to build little small apartments with 5 or 6 units, and they fit in great, and they're cheap to build. You don't have to be a huge developer to pull it off. So allowing more stuff like that to be just sort of allowed seems like those would all be positive directions to go into me. So.
Absolutely, and just for everybody's clarification, the county has a 2-tiered approach to lot size. We call those bulk development standards, you know, setbacks, things like that. The reason we have to do a two-tiered approach is because not everybody's on water and sewer. Some are on water, not sewer. Some are on water and sewer. Some are on nothing, well, septic. So your lot sizes do have to be customized to accommodate a septic system. The bad thing about a septic system is it takes a lot of area because you have a drain field and you can't develop on top of that drain field as well. And that's why the conversation regarding infrastructure is also a topic of today's session as well.
And Nate, earlier you were mentioning that currently it was 12 units, I think, and you were saying we need to bump that up in areas that's on the transportation corridor. What number were you thinking?
Hasn't really been established yet. I can tell you that a community-oriented development, the maximum density is, we can go as high as 250% of the base density. So the way to think about that, and forgive me for not including the specific numbers here, but East Haven sits on a very small piece of property. I want to say maybe 4 acres, and the density on that, I believe, is 90.
And can you just speak a little bit more about community-oriented development, because just in general, so that those
Sure.
listening or paying attention to understand what that is?
Sure. So the county undertook an innovative, it was homegrown. We developed it in-house. We looked at a way to encourage developers to build affordable housing. And also we worked in a number of green building techniques and also looked at the potential to develop properties that were in close proximity to transportation corridors. We're on public transit lines. We're near shopping and employment opportunities. And what it did was it said, okay, you can have additional density based on a point system. That program has been successful and it is voluntary. And I think that we should look at that, an opportunity to grow that program as well, since we have already tested it. But essentially, the higher the score, the more density you can get up to that maximum cap of 250%. We can make changes to it, but I do think we need to look at areas that have access to water and sewer and bump those up beyond 12, especially those that are on those transportation corridors as well.
Thank you.
So Nate, like,
No.
I guess kind of what are some options for us in terms of when we're thinking about like the future land use map and that where the urban services area is or whatever we're calling it? Are we thinking about changes of the zoning map to allow for density or require mixed use development, or like, are we thinking about it from the land use side?
I think we're looking at it from every angle.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we will probably consider is that a very large portion of the county is zoned open use with not a whole lot of development standards. As more and more development has occurred since 2009, we will probably need to look at the future land use map as a tool to influence future zoning decisions. Changing zoning, changing densities, without getting too far into the weeds today, that's sort of the goal, is that we do need to audit ourselves and look at the areas that are growing and be mindful of the areas that we want to preserve and that are near and dear to us, obviously farmlands and steep slopes and protected ridges. And also we need to take into consideration with climate change, climate resiliency, and also look at properties that are prone to hazards, specifically in the floodplain. So it's a trade-off, making sure that we sort of are specific on where we want to see development versus those areas that are either more hazardous or areas that we want to preserve.
All right, anything else on, any other questions on density-related items? Okay, great. Looks like we're gonna take a short break. We're gonna get lunch and come back and just keep working through lunch. So let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll start back up. Okay, great. So the next item is discussion around infrastructure.
Excellent. Okay, so, excuse me. There was some infrastructure analysis conducted as part of the planning process and looking at, all of the different public and utility services provided within the county. It's important to note that many of these are not kind of under the direct authority, of course, of Buncombe County as a local government, but they're partners that provide these utilities and services within the county. So for water and sewer is, and electricity included on that, water and sewer, you can see the lists there: Asheville Water, Biltmore Forest, Black Mountain Water, Montreat Water, and Weaverville and Woodfin Water districts all provide public potable water service within the county. And the Metropolitan Sewerage District, MSD, provides sewer service within the county. And we did kind of specifically look at some of the long-range plans for MSD and for Asheville Water in thinking about growth areas and areas that would be served by infrastructure within the future, looking at kind of a long-range timeline for the plan. Electricity provided by Duke Energy and French Broad Electric. Those are investor-owned utilities that are regulated by the state.
Don't forget Haywood Electric.
Did we forget Haywood Electric on there?
Haywood Electric, yeah, no.
Okay.
Good people of Canada get to elect one of their board members as well.
Okay, good catch. Thank you for that. We will note that. And then, other utility services provided: telephone, natural gas, stormwater. Buncombe County Stormwater Management Program does administer your stormwater ordinance. So that is one where you have kind of direct authority in terms of provision of that. Local government service, also many internet providers across the county. So, a couple things that we have looked at in terms of kind of infrastructure and how it kind of plays into land use planning for the county is, again, I mentioned we integrated the assessment of plans for future service areas from MSD and Asheville City Water. So as we were identifying the growth areas that we kind of mentioned in our last discussion, thinking about where infrastructure either exists today or is planned to be provided at some point in the future was an important part of helping to identify those areas. Also talking with folks from various departments within the county to identify critical needs for public safety, EMS services, and solid waste. As you think about kind of growth in the future and how you're going to continue to provide various levels of service for those different public services, it's important to kind of think ahead about what that means to for those departments. Okay, and so in terms of policies, in working draft version in the plan, implement regulatory actions to promote the growth protection conservation goal, and that kind of, some of those have some implications on infrastructure. More specifically and directly coordinating public water and wastewater services with plans for growth. So that's encouraging kind of municipal and kind of MSD not municipal, but kind of water service provider and sewer MSD partnerships in helping to coordinate plans for growth. Planning for the long-term sustainability of public services, expanding and supporting broadband and cellular service access for all residents of the county, and advancing energy conservation and sustainability were some of the key policies that are kind of directly tied to these infrastructure items. And in terms of actions, partnering again with utility providers to coordinate growth and infrastructure plans, that's going to be really important to make sure that as those infrastructure plans are updated, that they're aware of the county's intent in terms of where the county wants to be growing. I think that's going to be really important since that's kind of outside of your direct authority and control. Implementing policies around new development, redevelopment that advance energy conservation and sustainability, developing a long-term planning process for solid waste operations that prioritize sustainability, improving your capital improvement planning process to integrate equity analysis tool and to manage and prepare for growth and maintenance of public facilities and infrastructure. And that's the equity analysis tool that's fairly recently come out. There are other policies that support a balanced transportation network and recreation goals as well. We kind of have those in separate chapters within the plan that are outside of infrastructure, but we obviously want, under the broader umbrella of infrastructure, those are also important components that are included within the plan as well. So I will pause there and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Around the infrastructure with the roads, I know that's NCDOT, but that is always something that comes up. And so Nate, can you speak to that and how we can work with them, or do we work with them? Because that is always one of the main concerns around development.
We hear about traffic occasionally. I will say that in the county, if you're not maintained by NCDOT, it's going to be a private maintenance agreement. Every day we run across situations where there really is no agreement sometimes on privately maintained roads, so it's always tricky. A couple things I can tell you about is we have a great partnership with NCDOT. They are part of the development review process. They sit on what's called our Technical Review Committee. That's a committee that's comprised of county departments that review development ordinances. And in addition to that, we have our municipal water providers. Sometimes the city of Asheville has a seat on that. MSD is a part of that conversation as well. Things that we have done recently in the past that are higher standards. Some of you were on commission when we adopted the requirement for any development that has greater than 75 units or greater than 75 lots, we require a traffic study. That traffic study then gets sent on to Raleigh and locally the Division 13, and it can help with decisions that are made for improvements that occur. So whether you're an apartment complex that might need what's called a deceleration lane, getting folks off the main route in order to improve a traffic outcome, are some of the things that we do. And I think that has had a positive effect. I think that we would continue to look for opportunities to grow that relationship. And in addition to that, a couple of things you all should know is the NCDOT recently changed their Complete Streets program. What that means is if we prioritize areas of the county where we'd like to see, say, a bike lane or a sidewalk or a multimodal opportunity, if you capture that in a plan and they do a road widening project, they will build that. They will fully build that. Now, it used to be a cost-sharing arrangement. It was like an 80-20. But now, since they've changed that policy, if we prioritize the areas we want to see those improvements, they'll fully build that. There are a couple of you that sit on the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, through the French Broad, through Land of Sky, and you regularly review projects and improvements. I think that the comprehensive plan has a direct correlation with that relationship, in that we are going to be making some priorities where we want to see continual improvements with the goal that it's not just an automobile-oriented society anymore. People are looking for opportunities to be mobile in multiple different ways. Now, some of those I don't recommend, like that one wheel thing, but people are seeking different forms of transportation. That's the bottom line.
Thank you.
Should have asked this earlier, but what kind of feedback are you looking for, especially at this section?
Okay, so what I will tell you. Sure, well, I think it's everything. I think it's not only roads, but the future of water, the future of sewer. I don't think anything's off the table. I think that in years past, we might have been a little siloed. We don't do that. NCDOT does that, or we don't do that. MSD does it. But I think it's an organism conversation. I think that I can soon, we'll be coming to you all at a future briefing, probably the second meeting in October, alongside MSD to talk about some of the studied improvements that have been done thus far for 3 areas of the county. So we'll be looking at more in depth. I think that water has a very storied and long history in our area. And it's very interesting in the sense that most communities in North Carolina, if you're a water provider, that's your carrot and stick. to get folks to actually come into your incorporated area. Now here, of course, it's complicated. So that means dating all the way back to some of the original Sullivan Acts that go back to the 1920s and the Great Depression, Asheville does not have the ability to charge differential water rates. So they lose sort of that carrot and stick approach to get folks to come into their city. The other thing is that annexation laws have changed so greatly in North Carolina, there's no more involuntary annexation. So it makes us as a county have to sort of think in terms of somewhat more urban standard as a city. I will tell you that at Weaverville, Black Mountain, they have the ability to exercise differential water rates, so they still have sort of that carrot and stick approach. Montreat, Biltmore Forest, there's not really any opportunity for them to grow out. They're pretty hemmed in. So it's to introduce these topics and think about how we might want to partner with these agencies to influence the areas where it's appropriate to grow versus the areas where it's appropriate to conserve. And also think about things like, even from a solid waste perspective, about if we want to grow more recycling opportunities, compost opportunities, grow a biodigester. I mean, there's numerous opportunity here to influence how we want to see things over the next 20 years.
Is your thought that at this point, you're reaching out and communicating some with these other providers that we need to work with? Or is it more after we come up with this plan that we're interested in, then you're gonna work with them? So where's?
No, I think it's a combination of everything. Both Al, Robert, and myself sit on the MSD board. We've actually seen numerous presentations on the 3 studied areas that exist within MSD's realm, but MSD has some constraints as well that we can discuss at great length. I will tell you that as a matter of policy, Asheville is the largest water provider. They also sell a lot of water to the other municipalities that provide water. Many don't know that Woodfin has an independent water authority that's not part of the city. So it's very, very nuanced. There's even a couple of private water providers, Bent Creek, for example, and Ridgecrest is actually a small water provider. So I think it's the goal here is we don't have anything set in stone to discuss, but more of an awareness and more of to get the gears turning in terms of what we might want to see as part of the plan.
So Nate, sorry, Brandon, but I guess one thing that comes to mind is DOT. You mentioned several times now the sidewalk situation where it more or less prompted us to, if we're interested, identify corridors that we'd like to see sidewalk improvements on. I guess I would personally love to see this board expand on that list, provide DOT and the MPO more feedback, more recommendations, more advice than just that one thing.
Yeah, and of course that's complicated too. While the DOT might build you a sidewalk as part of a project, they won't maintain it.
Yeah.
So we have to think about maintenance of sidewalks as well. We have to think about the fact that we have pieces and parts of sidewalk all throughout former Asheville's ETJ that we probably need to prioritize in-house and look at how we start connecting those. I'd say one of the best things to look at and understand where we might want to prioritize are what's called goat paths. And that's people just naturally walking on the side of roads with no sidewalk now. So they're kind of having to bushwhack their own path.
This is kind of outside our traditional thinking about what our lane is too, but one of the other areas I would like for us to think more about in the future. I mean, we're looking at the county-owned properties for redevelopment, which is great. We already own them, so what can we do there? As I've put down on some long emails, I really believe proximity to work, and all these reasons, getting as much growth to happen like in the heart of Asheville, like is a key strategic goal, right? You know, everything, the growth that we can steer here means we're not building it out on the farm, we're not building out on the city space. Where the vast majority, where the highest concentration of jobs are. So it's people, you know, walking or biking or taking transit to work, or going a mile instead of 20 miles, right? So for all those different reasons. So how do we see a lot of growth in downtown, but, you know, are there things that we could do from a policy or from an infrastructure standpoint that would, say, over the next 20 years, mean that like the downtown metro area captures 25% of regional growth instead of capturing 7% of regional growth? I'm making those numbers up. You know, are there things that we could do there? I think there probably are. You know, I mean, but we probably think of this as like that's a municipality's job, right? There's the city, they do infrastructure there, and to a large degree, they, you know, they obviously are in charge of the regulatory issues and things like that. But just like I think we have to kind of think maybe in new ways about how we work with MSP, like maybe we need to think about those things too, because there might be things that it's in the counties, it's desirable from our perspective to see things happen that, you know, municipalities may not be able to do or might not do on their own. So I don't know, this would be other kind of, I don't know, I mean, have any of those questions been thought about through this process? I mean, like, what would be, like, what could we do from an infrastructure standpoint if we said we would like to see more of the growth captured in the heart of the urbanized area rather than sprawl? What would that infrastructure?
Yeah, one of the things I can tell you, and we're meeting with our friends in the planning department with Asheville tomorrow, is how can they, or how do we have a conversation related to maybe they incentivize someone to come into the city in the former ETJ areas. I mean, those are not in the city now, but they're in that sphere of influence just around the city. I think that more downtown growth would be a conversation with city staff on how they continue to incentivize, because it is more or less a carrot and stick approach. I think market forces are something that's in a capitalistic society are tricky to work with as well. So I think that it is a conversation about how they might incentivize folks to, because we have to be careful here that we don't put up too many barriers. It's a delicate sort of conversation. It's a push-pull situation.
Yeah, but infrastructure and market forces, those are different things, right? Like where we put the MSD lines, that's where the growth's gonna go, right? Like the market will kind of do, I mean, if we just said, let's just let the market do what it's gonna do, then we would let the market just build infrastructure. But if we're gonna get involved in building infrastructure, now we're kind of choosing where the market's gonna, you know, where the investments are gonna go, right? So it could be sewer lines run out to the county, or it could be like in more public parking and better transit and maybe innovative car sharing services in the heart of Asheville, right? Like if we did those things, like a lot of developers might think, wow, that's really cool. If I knew they were gonna do that stuff over the next 20 years, like I'm gonna plan, you know, a bunch more projects downtown, because that won't all just, like that kind of infrastructure won't have to be shouldered totally by the private sector, right? Like the public sees that there's kind of a role there to play too. So I'm eager for this comp plan to go ahead, but I do, if the main goal here is to kind of steer where growth goes, I do hope that we'll at least contemplate some of those ideas in the comp plan so that it creates the space to think about those things more into the future.
Just another sort of idea to throw in the mix as we think about development in the sort of downtown and immediately adjacent areas is, in addition to mapping the city and county-owned and potentially state-owned, publicly owned properties there, I think it would be an interesting exercise to map sort of who are some of the other major landowners in this area, and whether there might be some collaborative or partnership opportunities. In other parts of the country, for instance, we've seen churches which often own fairly large assets from both a building and sometimes land perspectives, and are sometimes, and I say this as a minister in a mainline denomination, like struggling with having their church filled, and the building is often sitting quite underutilized for most of the week, be partners in affordable housing development projects or partners in some of the other kind of types of community resources that, to some extent, I mean, maybe less than what you're talking about, Brownie, was sort of concrete capital infrastructure, but things like downtown groceries or early childhood centers, the kind of additional resources that make livability a different kind of conversation. So I'd be really interested if we could kind of get a handle on, maybe just as a starting point, sort of nonprofits that own significant amounts of, significant buildings or land in the downtown area where there might be some conversation opportunities that the county could be at the table at.
I was gonna, kind of to that point and the previous point, there is some language in here. It's not specifically listed on our slides here, but it talks about the county government serving as a convener for various partners, municipalities being one of the primary groups to be partnering with, along with utility providers, to kind of identify those types of opportunities and have potentially regular, quarterly, or whatever it looks like, meetings to be kind of thinking through, new projects that are coming down the pipeline, infrastructure, investments that are being discussed, as a way to kind of help identify and, provide a platform for different partners that maybe aren't getting together around the table as frequently today to have those types of discussions. School districts as well can be another partner at that table that, kind of an important one to be thinking about. So that's one of the recommendations. I talked a little bit earlier about Wake County and their, ordinance revisions that they've made, but one of the important things that they're doing is when they see a project come in the county that they think should really be a municipal project, it shouldn't be kind of, maybe it's not changing the the actual location, but it should come in and be supported by municipal services and come in under their standards as part of their, continuation of their growth pattern. They're having those kind of focused discussions and bringing that applicant and the municipality to the table to try to work out how can we really, we want this to be municipal, that's our policy direction, how can we make that happen? How can we as a county be supportive in making that happen?
Yes, Brownie, I would just reemphasize what you said. I think it's crucial if Asheville doesn't get its act together and start pushing the city to develop less like a Charlotte suburb and more like an urban place with a land scarcity problem, we're all gonna have a problem. We're just gonna run out of room for the amount of growth that we expect to see. I also think you mentioned the market, like the market's kind of acting like that too, like at a micro level, right? It's not, we're not building things the way we should be out of necessity. We're building things like this community is Wake County or Mecklenburg County. We're, again, gonna run out of room if we keep doing that. The same goes for NCDOT. I don't think they treat our community any differently than they do other parts of the state either. They just continue to widen roads in our flat, developable areas where the roads have always been. So those are the kind of things I think about all the time.
And I know it's like, like Nate's talking about the history of the water stuff, we all know about that. But there's just been, part of the reason I think we feel like, the convening and stuff like that, I'm all for it. I think we definitely need more of that communication and collaboration. But I also think that there's just been a set of like historical things that have happened that make it really hard for Asheville to kind of like shoulder all this stuff on its own. They've gotten disadvantaged, and they've been treated in a disadvantaged way when it comes to management of their water system. If Asheville had been treated like every other city in the state for the last 50 years when it comes to water, and new developments, when proposed, that connect to the city water system, become part of the city, like, that's the way cities happen. Like,
Yeah.
Charlotte and Raleigh don't go out annexing people. You connect to their water system, you come in the city automatically, and everybody understands. Instead of Asheville being 90,000 people right now, it'd probably be like about 120,000 or something like that. And Asheville would have the tax base and the regulatory authority to do a lot of stuff to kind of like steer regional growth. But right now, and because all that stuff's not in the city, you know what? All the sales tax stuff, they get hosed on that too, right? we benefit from it. They get hurt by it. So like, in Charlotte, they built light rail, right? And it's transforming the way that growth and development happen in Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. You see all this growth, going to where they're putting that urban infrastructure. Probably building light rail isn't what makes sense here, right? Because we're just, it's a different, maybe it does, but probably it doesn't, at least not right now. But just because we don't do light rail doesn't mean there's not a whole lot of other stuff in terms of infrastructure investment and urban services that would change the pattern of development here, I think, for the better, in terms of where housing goes, where growth goes. And I just don't think it's realistic to just kind of think like Asheville can handle all that on their own, in part because of the governmental decisions locally and at the state level that have been made over a long period of time that I think have put Asheville in a much different position than the other major metro areas in the state to be able to have the fiscal capacity to make those kinds of investments. So for all those different reasons, I just feel like we should be talking more, and we should bring an open, if we want to see more growth happen, infill development, where the jobs are, not sprawl, then I think we ought to be open to playing a role in that.
Because you all have kind of the unique perspective of looking across the jurisdictions within your county boundary, I think that makes so much sense what you just said. And I'm thinking about two other examples in Wake County. Wake County decided to take the lead on their transit planning effort. So they partnered, of course, with Raleigh and all the other municipalities, but it was the county's transit plan. They were looking holistically across the county and how that system should work. And they did the same thing for affordable housing. Even though they don't really want to direct affordable housing to the unincorporated portions of the county, they developed a countywide housing plan to work in partnership with Raleigh and the other 11 municipalities to find ways to construct and new units or protect naturally occurring affordable housing, a whole host of other solutions. So they're taking that convener role, again, knowing that they're not the only one that's going to be, directly, making these things happening, but partnering with these other communities to make it happen with that unique perspective that they have as like a county government.
What else? Other questions, thoughts around infrastructure? All right, if not, are we ready to go to affordable housing?
Last one, yes,
All right,
speak
let's
of
do it.
affordable housing. Okay. So, you all are very familiar, I'm sure, with the Bowen report that came out in '21, the housing needs assessment for Western North Carolina. It looked at many communities, including Buncombe County, and projected several things. So there are, statistics that they break down in terms of demand for rental and owner-occupied housing. The slide here focuses on rental housing and the significant senior affordable housing gap. There are kind of two different formats that they looked at, the kind of using the North Carolina housing finance format and the U.S. Housing and urban development format. So, several thousand units that are kind of identified as rental gaps within Buncombe County. And then when we look for owner-occupied housing, we also see several, depending on which of the guidelines that you're using for the North Carolina Housing Finance Authority, it's slightly less, but upwards of 700 plus senior housing units and over 1,300 family affordable housing units that are a gap in the community. Looking kind of closely, most of the housing units in the county, more than 3/4, are either single-family, one-unit detached housing or manufactured homes. And we know that many of those households and those homes are cost burdened. They spend more than 30% of their total annual household income on rent or mortgage and are considered to be cost burdened. And that's been rising in the county. So between 2015, 2019, 56.6% of renter households were cost burdened. And during that same time period, the state rental housing cost burden households trended downward. So while it was going up here, it was actually going downward kind of across the state. We also know that between 2016 and 2020, the median price of a home sold in the county increased by 33%. So quite a significant jump in price points. The average 2020, the average house was on the market for 17 days, so they're going quick. 97% of houses sold for at or above the listed price. So there's, a supply challenge there, and they're going for higher than actual asking price. And more than 30% of those home closings were in cash. So we know that affordable housing is an issue, and this is a very kind of hot market to be trying to buy a house within, or even find rental housing. This map here shows households with gross rent exceeding 30% of household income. So that cost burden kind of housing threshold that US HUD identifies. And you can see it's kind of a gradient here. So the darker you get, that's the higher the percentage of households that have rents that exceed that 30% of household income. So the darker it is, the more housing cost burden kind of households there are within those areas. And so we know it's not just the urban areas, it's kind of across the board. There's some argument to be made that some of these households might actually, some particularly more affluent households might choose to spend more than 30% on their house because it is a choice that they can make. But many of these are households that have more limited incomes, and they don't have an alternative choice in terms of housing that that would be more affordable to them. So in terms of the draft policies and actions that we've got in the plan, increasing housing options and improving housability for all residents, supporting development on infill redevelopment and adaptive reuse sites, again, trying to encourage density. Usually when you're in an infill redevelopment or adaptive reuse site, for a property owner to kind of make a profit off that development, they're going to need to increase density. That's some opportunity potentially for providing more units, which can help with the affordability issue and definitely help with the supply issue. Providing adequate housing options to all income levels to meet the needs of economic development opportunities. So this does have an economic development implication as businesses look to expand or relocate maybe to the area. They're going to want to know that the workers that they're going to be employing have a place to live and that it's affordable to them. And there are other policies that support increases in housing density in growth areas in the county. We wanted to kind of summarize and identify the most pertinent ones. In terms of the actions, so implementing equity-oriented housing policies that address historically disadvantaged groups. So, again, taking an equity lens to this plan, we want to make sure that we're focusing on those groups and other neighborhoods at risk of gentrification and displacement. Expanding and protecting affordable and accessible housing choices, implementing regulatory actions to promote the goals of the growth, protection, and conservation goal, and supporting the economic advancement of historically disadvantaged communities are some of those key kind of summary actions there. So I will pause and take any comments or questions that you have.
We talk about this a lot, so it's not like this is, it's kind of like what to revisit, other things we've talked about. I don't know, I guess, and this is just a really high-level question, but, obviously we've got our housing programs and we support specific projects with funding, and we can try to do the bond referendum. That's up to the voters, but if it passes, that'll infuse more funds into the effort. And I think we're trying to put a lot of thought into like how to, it's such a big problem, like how do we take the resources we have, even if we get a bond passed, and get the most bang for the buck out of that. I think there's good ideas emerging around all that. I guess I just wonder, like, if there's any way to sort of forecast with the different policy options that might be available to us once the comp plan is adopted and we adopt some of these implementing measures to go along with them. Because I think we're kind of getting we're getting a sense for how many affordable units or moderate units we might be able to help build in Buncombe County, where we're actively partnering with developers and putting some financial investment into projects to help make it work. But with some of the tools in the toolbox we might have, where we're encouraging it more through land use, policies, like, do we have some sense for like what that might look like? like over the next 15 years, like we're gonna see this much growth, and we're hoping through policies where we don't necessarily have to put our own dollars into it, you know, like how many units might we get out of that? Is it, or what percentage? Might it be 5% or 10%? I don't know if there's any way at this level to kind of forecast that, because we see these big numbers that we need to produce in the county over this period of time, you know, and it's thousands, right? So, and I think, again, we're getting a sense for how many, where we're directly co-investing in projects, how many we can produce per year on average or through 2030 and beyond. And is there some additional amount we can start thinking about through good policies? We probably can also encourage, you know, this kind of future growth. So I don't, it's just a high level question at this point.
I think, one, I would say it's a really interesting time to be forecasting a lot of things because there are so many unknowns. But I think, a simple calculation that you could do is kind of look at what you've been able to do in terms of partnering on affordable housing over maybe a short period of time over the last few years, and kind of what your building permits have been during that time frame, and kind of see what that percentage looks like. I mean, that's a trend, so to speak, of what you've been able to accomplish. It's hard to predict, once these policies are implemented, how that might change from a numeric standpoint. I mean, we definitely hope that what's gonna happen is it's gonna raise the needle in terms of that trend, and that there would be more affordable housing being constructed. To the exact extent that, we could predict that level would increase, that's pretty hard to determine. I do see some communities set goals for those things, and those are somewhat, sometimes they're a little arbitrary. They might be based on kind of some level of what they've been able to accomplish in the past and kind of upping those numbers for the future. I don't know if you have any additional kind of thoughts on that.
That was gonna be my question to you. What are other communities doing as far as that percentage of new development coming in, and I don't know if it's an exaction or a request that they're asking for, but what does that look like in other communities?
I mean, there are some communities that have, basically kind of chosen to kind of step into a challenging legal realm and do inclusionary housing within North Carolina. There are not many of them, but there are, several. And a lot of those communities are using kind of a standard somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of units within a new subdivision that's being built, that they would be, deed restricted affordable housing at the end of the day. And that's, I think, fairly common across the United States. When you're talking about inclusionary housing, I think those are generally kind of the ranges that a lot of communities work within. But that's just kind of as part of a new development. That doesn't include a situation where you might be partnering, for example, on a project, and as part of that partnership where you're investing funding or land or whatever the investment is, that maybe you're encouraging for a higher rate of affordable housing to be built as part of that partnership effort. So it's just, I wish I could give you a better answer in terms of forecasting. I think one thing that we've learned about affordable housing is that it does take kind of every tool in the toolbox, particularly for high growth, highly desirable communities where it's the most kind of, it's really a serious problem that's impacting these communities. We've done a number of affordable housing nexus support studies for Teton County, Wyoming, Jackson Hole area, and they have kind of a lot of unique and similar circumstances where they're really limited in terms of land that can be developed. The rates of, the prices of land are just skyrocketing. I think their median housing cost as of like sometime earlier this year, I think I was telling you this earlier, it's over $1 million. So I think that, I think there's some good examples of other communities out there, and they leverage, in Teton County and Jackson Hole, they partner together on affordable housing, and they use every tool that they can. They work with businesses. They actually have a linkage fee on businesses. Again, I think that's in North Carolina one of those, sticky wickets in terms of what's illegally allowed. But they are a good kind of example, I think, for this community to potentially look at in terms of the whole field of different tools that are available to the community.
And I'll just piggyback on that, and I'll say some of the things we are doing now from a policy standpoint are probably in our best interest. One of those things is we are now looking at, state-owned properties, having conversation with the state. We can have conversations with schools. I mean, think of all the mowed fields that are just mowed. Those could be potential partnerships. And I heard churches earlier. And it's not, just limited to affordable housing. Sometimes affordable housing needs an early childhood component, childcare. So I think that we're already starting to be very proactive. And I would also say too, that I think that incentivizing density, back to that conversation, can lessen the load, if you will, and reserve more money that we might give through our affordable housing services program, because it lowers the overall cost as well. So those are some important policy initiatives that I think we're already sort of underway and looking at right now.
One thing sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry. And we can come back. I want to go back to the map for a moment.
The cost burden map.
That's it. Thank you. It's just right there. To me, that's a really telling story, that we know that there are already folks in our county living in these particular areas that are cost burden. I'm curious, and I'm probably getting real into the Affordable Housing Committee weeds on this, but is there an opportunity as we move forward in the comp plan to utilize this map for some of our planning in terms of which new projects to support? I think there's also often misconceptions when we talk about affordable housing that folks need to be right within the city and on public transportation lines. And I don't disagree that that's an important component, but what this map tells me is that we need higher quality housing for people that are already living here, that may be living in substandard housing at this point, or unsafe housing. And I'm curious, can we dig in as we move forward and look at, what types of housing are they currently living in? Are they homes that need repair? Do we need to look at higher density, rental opportunities, catch that missing middle, moving forward? But this is a very telling story to me, with just a couple of variations of the shade of blue.
And haven't we found, I know that there was some talk with manufactured housing and some of that, right? Some people, that's naturally occurring affordable housing, and that there's probably a significant amount of homes throughout the county, especially you see some of the darker areas are actually in our more rural areas, that we need to look at those programs that help support people and keep them in their homes. So that's my hunch with some of what we're seeing there.
And that's the home repair piece, that emergency home assistance, that I'm wondering if we can dig in a couple layers deeper on that. That's a great point, Terry.
I want us to go back, let's go back to the bullet points, the deal before, the screen before.
Was it the actions?
Yeah, back right there. When we look at the first bullet point there, now, historically and even today, the problems that we have in our community, it's going to be hard to find another community in America to look at. So we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and do something about, when you look at implement equity-oriented housing policy that address the historically disadvantaged. That's something that we've been talking about. I've been back home since '71, and I'm tired of hearing us talk about it. But now with the comp plan, we've got the opportunity to do something, and we can't afford to pass it up. Now, how do we attack it?
So I think that one of the things that, there are several things that we recommend under this action here. I think improving, so there are kind of 3 specific bullets that are listed here. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything on the next page. And this is specific to this action here. It's not affordable housing across the board generally, but this kind of focus on historically disadvantaged communities. And that is looking to make sure that your current strategy that you're using is really kind of looking through that lens to make sure that the programs are assisting those communities. providing kind of better access to the existing programs you've had, affordable housing services, affordable housing home repair, energy efficiency services, property tax relief for low-income housing owners, making sure that those services are made available to those property owners. And then the third is considering the creation of strategies to address gaps in service and meeting the needs of chronically homeless and those with mental health conditions within the community. You know, as we talk about this, one of the things that kind of came up in my mind, and you know, I think some of these are challenged in terms of kind of Fair Housing Act. You know, we can't discriminate by certain kind of protected classes within this country. We're not allowed to do that. So, you know, I think one of the challenges that we have is how do we kind of how do we support some of these historically disadvantaged groups and provide them with better, more affordable housing, or help them with kind of staying within their own homes so that they aren't gentrified and displaced. It's very complicated. I'm just going to kind of, you know, share, you know, if I'm not certain that you could, I don't think that you could kind of limit new affordable housing to specific groups based on race and ethnicity, for example, because I think the fair housing laws probably would not allow you to do that because they're written to not exclude based on race and ethnicity and other protected classes. So I think that that's, you know, it's meant to be protective of those classes, so it's there for good reason, but it also can pose a challenge in some degree in terms of how you want to advance and providing affordable housing to those communities. So I think a lot of it is kind of making sure that the populations that need that assistance are made aware, and that you know, maybe there's more effort to be providing that to them, and really just increasing the kind of housing stock available and protecting those units that are naturally occurring as much as you can. Now, I think that the creation of the new units, that's really kind of a land use planning and zoning thing, and I think we've been talking about a lot of different ways to help kind of create those new units. When you're talking about protecting naturally occurring affordable housing, that's really more of a funding initiative. That's a different thing that you don't, there might be some ways that you can use land use planning and zoning to protect those areas, but you're really talking about changing market dynamics when you're talking about protecting those. And it's either purchasing those housing units and restricting them, or partnering with some other organization to do that. That's really kind of that's another kind of programmatic way that you can go about protecting existing housing, which I think a lot of communities that are really stressed on this topic, they're looking at all the different avenues that they can to be, you know, building the new and protecting what's on the ground today.
But I think when you look at this community, it wouldn't be as difficult as you might think, because when we talk about, you know, housing policies that address historically disadvantaged, we have, now if you want to look at it on a racial basis, we have black and whites who are disadvantaged. You know, when you look at a lot of people in the outlying areas, they have the same problems that the black people do in urban areas in the city of Asheville. So I'm not sure that that argument would hold up. Looks like to me we can deal with that in our community. You know, I heard that same, for 40 years in banking, I had to fight that same argument, and I disagree with it every year. But I think this is something that we can get around that and work with it, because we have all, you know, it's poor people in our county who are affected by that. But if we address these the right way and do what we should do, it's going to take care of everybody.
So through, I think, again, through kind of, you know, trying to use all of your tools to be able to build as many new units as possible within growth areas, within the constraints that make sense. And then in terms of the naturally occurring affordable housing and the places that you don't want to be gentrified, or people and business owners displaced, particularly renters, because they're the most at risk for displacement. You know, I think that, you know, through small area planning, you can identify some of those locations and think more specifically about what the tools are that are going to assist those communities, because one of the challenges here is this is a large county. No area is like another area in terms of the challenges that it might face or the tools that might be best used to support those areas. I think that there are some other tools that can be looked at as you're reviewing specific development projects. You can kind of look at the context and thinking about kind of your equity opportunity index that you've recently come out with, and thinking about, you know, how this area is going to be affected if this project were to move forward, so we're not exacerbating the problem, making it worse. How can we actually create solutions as part of that project instead of creating more issues within the community? So I think that some of this is going to happen on kind of a project by project basis, and kind of looking at what can be either negotiated or kind of dealt with as part of development review. And then I think, as you raised earlier, if the bond is supported, you know, having significant funding to be able to go and do, you know, larger scale projects, I think will make a big difference. And some of that funding could be used in various, you know, ways.
Appreciate the chance to dig in on this, and thanks for raising it, Al. I mean, on that question of sort of what tools exist around helping to preserve the naturally occurring affordable housing, I think we are using some tools currently, but somewhat discreetly, rather than kind of saying how can these in a really strategic way help to preserve some of the affordable housing that's there. So for instance, and work against some of the effects of gentrification and displacement. So we're doing the property tax assistance for income qualifying homeowners. We're, I think, taking a very thorough look at ways the reval process can be as equitable as possible and address disparities either resulting from either methodology or just what's happening at the market level that are disproportionately impacting folks in some of these neighborhoods. We have a set of recommendations there, but then we obviously have some longer term work we need to keep doing. We have the homeowner repair and assistance programs that are about trying to keep housing stock safe and allow people to stay in their homes. And then through grants programs, we've supported some local initiatives that are trying to incentivize landlords keeping rental units affordable. And I think right now those things sort of live across at least 4 different areas of the county's work. Or they tend to come to us in a fairly siloed way. And I just wonder if there might be some opportunities to think about some goal setting within those that relate directly to these goals, or ways that we could more aggressively pursue one or more of those strategies, or if there are other tools we should be looking at around preserving the sort of existing affordable housing that is part of the market. So this conversation kind of helps me think about that in a more focused way.
One program we supported through ARPA was the voucher
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
support program that we were referring
That's
to.
what I'm referring to,
I
the
think-
one that Thrive
Yeah,
Asheville, I think, is coordinating. Was it?
yep.
Yeah,
That's right.
okay.
I think it'd be really interesting to see how successful that is. I think that would be
Right.
telling.
Yeah.
Because that's one super cheap, relatively easy, to the extent any of this is easy.
Yeah.
Way to preserve existing housing stock or use existing housing stock. I think one thing was mentioned, but it's not on this list, but is on your bigger document, is inclusionary zoning. Something that I think is just one tool that we have to consider. It's something several local governments in the state have used for many years without a lawsuit successfully, so I think that's good news. But yeah, Jasmine, I think there's a lot going on that even as a member of the housing committee, I don't know that we all will always see all of it together in one place. And that's harder to like follow along with our successes and like identify what the goals should be before meeting them.
What was that last thing you said? What was the last thing you said?
I was just saying it's like the siloed situation Jasmine mentioned, it makes it more difficult to understand if we're meeting our goals or not, or if our goals are even covering all the activities that we're undertaking.
I'm curious with the steering committee, did anything come up around affordable housing that we've not talked about here today? Is there anything else that you can?
What'd you do, Nate?
One example I can give you is that they've actually gotten some monies through probably strategic partnerships and the Affordable Housing Services Program, but the Poder Emma Group, they've actually pooled resources together and bought some smaller manufactured home parks and created essentially co-ops. That is one really great grassroots, out-of-the-box thinking, come together, pool your resources out of community that I think we should champion as well. I think it's worked really well for them. And in fact, they've even taken that a step further to apply for some funds to then have their own emergency repair program.
Which we
and-
approved.
So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Nate.
And I think commissioners as well, it seems siloed because they're all different funding streams, but we can make sure we package that so you can get the results. When we report back to you, we can report as one holistic project. I do know that we do try to track them all to see how we're affecting housing in our community, but all of the different funding streams seem to make it seem siloed, so we can bring that back as one holistic response.
And partly, what I took away from Jasmine with that too is just our communication with the community so that they're aware of all these things that we are doing, and so they're able to know about the potential to access it.
I think we do really well on the communication part, but wrapping it all together is the piece that I think we're missing on.
And I think maybe, I don't know, you had asked a question before in thinking about kind of what communities have set for goals for affordable housing. I mentioned Teton County, Wyoming, they actually set a goal in their comprehensive plan. It may have been updated since then, I'm not sure if they've changed it, but when we last worked with them in 2017, they had a goal that they wanted to make it clear that their affordable housing was for people that lived and worked in the community. That's what their mission was. So again, I'm not, suggesting that that is exactly the right fit for Buncombe, but this was Teton County's goal. And so they set the goal of having 65% of their workforce kind of living affordably within their community. And it's a hard to reach goal. I don't know exactly where they are in terms of meeting that goal, but that's kind of how they're thinking about it, is we want to make sure that the units that we're bringing on that are affordable are for people that are actually kind of living and working within the community. And we're going to try to prioritize that. And they actually, their housing authority is responsible for not only kind of managing those homes, but managing kind of the eligibility and qualification requirements for folks that live in those deed-restricted affordable units, and they set their qualifications. That's one thing we help them work on, to make sure that they, are earning certain income, not only earning certain incomes, but actually kind of live and work in the community as well. So that's another kind of way that they can help manage and make sure they're achieving that goal.
The density conversation is all about housing too, for me. Just create more of it, more space for it. You could, by 2043 or whatever the date is, can have whole neighborhoods of quadruplexes. And every time anyone builds us a big box store, there could be housing next to it or on top of it. These are things that are built without a lot of thought in places of kind of necessity. And we just have to make it necessary here too.
I agree with that. I mean, one of the critiques, of the density argument from people who do, I think, genuinely care about affordable housing and oppose gentrification. It's not like the NIMBY thing, but people who really, really do care about gentrification, oppose density. And the line of argument is, some NIMBY people might kind of agree with this too, but is, well, you can build all that stuff, but it's still just going to continue to gentrify, right? That density doesn't automatically create a degree of affordability. I think in an area that's growing like ours, where there's population pressure, part of the answer to that was, if we're not producing more supply and there's the development pressure, well, we can guarantee you this problem is not only going to get worse, it's going to accelerate, right? So just the supply and demand thing is kind of, I think, a good answer to that. But I do think, in a place like Buncombe County, in some ways there is a fair point there to be made there, that just our area is it is so attractive. We spend a ton of money, taxpayer money, telling the whole world to come here and check this place out, many of whom decide to stay. And that it's so popular, we could build a lot, and it would all be expensive, right? Just because, like, there's enough affluent people in our society who think, God, living in Asheville would be my dream, right? So I think we need the density, we need the supply side, but through our own investments and our land use policies, we do have to, like, create a set of policies whereby it's not all just gonna be driven by the market, or it'll all be, like, or the gentrification will just happen with the supply. Maybe not quite as bad, but maybe almost as bad. So, I feel like we probably do, as we look at the growth forecast, and I think we probably do need to set some kind of high-level goals, like you're talking about with the county in Wyoming, where we think about, you know, of this like a percentage of our growth, like, needs to be affordable and moderately priced. I think we've started getting at a lot of that through the committee, or Affordable Housing Committee's work, where we set these affordable housing goals. The distinction there, though, I think, is that we were kind of coming at this from sort of the mindset of what we have the ability to influence, right? Like our committee, with the funding that the commission approves to kind of support, it was sort of like, how do we stretch those dollars far enough to reach these goals? And we came up with these, you know, I think, really good goals with that frame in mind. But the comp plan is kind of taking a step further back, though, and thinking about, like, all this growth that's going to occur, and not just like Buncombe County's direct investments that can play a role, but, like, through a larger set of policies, what's that goal, which would be a bigger goal, or or thinking about a percentage of the growth that would fit into these categories. And then our direct efforts certainly play a big part of that, but not the only part. What else, y'all? This is good discussion. Other thoughts on affordability? Anything else from the staff or from the team on this one?
So can we go back to this morning's discussion then? Jasmine asked a question around timing.
Yep.
And we all look like deers in headlights.
I didn't mean to startle anybody.
But what we put on the table then was, can we talk about some of the things you heard, and what we priorities, if you want us to move forward in any one thing before we come forward with a bigger package? I think is how Leanne phrased it. So were there anything you heard today that you want to, like, step one, step two, and we can't think about it that way?
Specifically of what we discussed today? Okay.
I mean, some things that come to mind, sorry. During the affordable housing goal setting process, there was a time where staff showed us these slides of other communities and, like, their goals. It was like Mecklenburg and Wake. I would love to see something similar with conditional zoning, like New Hanover does it this way, like with these thresholds for these land use types.
So kind of case studies.
Yeah, like a matrix of examples, or something. A matrix of other people's matrices.
Yep.
And then, what else? I think, I've been talking about inclusionary zoning ever since I got sworn in. I mean, I think thinking about examples of that sooner than later would be something I would be interested in.
Do you want to see mandatory only, or do you want to see voluntary as well?
I think there's 3 or 4 cities that have mandatory, and then there's 1 or 2 with voluntary, and I recall reading the ordinances long ago, I couldn't tell the difference, but
Okay.
both.
The municipalities that require it are Davidson,
Chapel Hill,
Chapel-
Manteo,
Manio.
I think those are the 3. There might be another, but that I'm missing, but.
I thought Carver.
Yes, through their, that one's kind of, yeah. Yeah, it's not the same as it's not implemented the same way, so it's a little different.
And as we think about that, there's a lot of conversation of what's allowed and not allowed in North Carolina, so if you can make sure we have that lens as well. Yeah.
sorry, I'm kind of talking to myself. I don't know what to tell you about density, like.
He does that all the time. We're used to it.
It seems like density will be something that shakes itself out as we make the future land use map or wherever we're going. And I don't know what else to tell you on that one.
Is the board thinking that conditional zoning is like phase one? That's what you really want us to dig in?
I think so
about
as
a timeline
well.
on that?
Yeah, if you're wanting us
Yeah.
to prioritize, it seems to me that we really need to dig in on that
Conditional
aspect of
zoning.
it.
Thank you.
So following up on that, I mean, I mean, I think we should do conditional zoning, should be like, tool in the toolbox. But part of what I was hearing from the conversation earlier is that, like, in conjunction with setting up this conditional zoning option for landowners and developers, there's a set of things that we could do through special use permits, whereby we basically are kind of saying, look, here's some things we would really love to see incorporated in most new developments, especially of over a certain size. We want some affordability, we want some green building elements and clean energy elements that, are different than just the building code. You don't have to do this, but there's things we'd love to see happen in most new projects. And if you do some of these things in your projects, then yes, as a use by right, you can do your project. Otherwise, if it's a project over X size, you're gonna go talk to the county commission, and you can do a conditional use zoning process or conditional zoning. But wow, that sounds like a lot of work. So here's what you can just do, but you gotta do a few of these extra things. So that's not conditional zoning, but it sounds like it kind of happens in conjunction with the creation of conditional zoning, if I'm understanding it correctly. Because in some ways, I think that process over here, in terms of like us achieving some of our goals, might actually be the most important thing, because it's probably the path a lot of people are going to choose to go down.
Right, and I think that's the list of exactions that
Yeah.
Parker wanted to see from other municipalities.
I guess I just think of those in conjunction, right?
Right,
I
yeah,
mean,
Parker was asking for the exactions, and that's
Right.
what Bernie's saying, what are those exactions
Right.
that we need to put in that table?
Well, I think Parker was specifically asking about like inclusionary zoning, which would be just kind of a more kind of plain requirement for inclusion of some percentage of affordable housing in projects over a certain size. But it's like, we're not asking, this is just the land use policy in Buncombe County, so if you want to build in our county, that's the way it's going to be. These are more, this isn't a mandate, they are incentivized, but perhaps very strongly incentivized by avoiding triggering a much more lengthy development process, right? And I'd love to look at both. And I'd like to look at both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what's most helpful in what order, but I would like to look at both.
Me too.
A request I'd have, and this is, I think, sort of speaks to what you're asking, Avril, and is probably kind of self-evident, but there's a lot of stuff coming at us in real time that directly relates to a lot of this content. And I think just the more we can kind of pause in those conversations and make sure that we're working on those things, whether it's the conversation around the Ferry Road development, or whether it's looking at how we implement recommendations around the ad hoc, from the ad hoc committee around the reval process and equity, the more we can just sort of deliberately pause in those conversations and think about how that intersects with the comp plan, I would find to be really helpful, so that we make sure that we're making real-time, project-specific decisions in a way that's consistent with where we anticipate landing in the comp plan. And/or are there opportunities to push the gas a little on some of these real-time decisions, because we're having these more in-depth discussions and thinking about the intersections of these different issues. So I know that might apply to a decent number of things that are in front of us, but it just feels like there's enough in two lanes happening in real time that I don't want us to lose the opportunity to implement some of this right now. And one lane is, I think, really proactive projects where the county is the driver on them, that we're trying to move the needle in good ways. And the other is things that are happening that we have not to date been regulating or addressing in any ways, or but that if we, that we might need to just kind of take a different posture towards as we move forward, between now and when the comp plan is finalized. So it feels in a way like this work session is an opportunity to pivot into a different kind of approach to some of our near-term decision-making. So that it just feels, again, this is probably self-evident, but that it's a more focused and oriented towards like where we're trying to land with the comp plan, if that makes sense. So like, I mean, like a concrete thing is just, maybe, pausing as we're talking around the Ferry Road updates we get, which sometimes can be kind of cursory because we've all been thinking about them and saying like, okay, how is this ticking some of the priorities we know we're identifying around affordable housing? That was a bit long-winded, but hopefully there's something workable in there.
And I would say we have been conscious in making sure that we're checking the box on the goals from the affordable housing under Ferry Road, but we don't have yet a fully fleshed out plan. That is, DFI is helping us to get there. But we know that when we bring something forward, it has to check the boxes on those, and we would not violate the policies that we're also talking about. So I get what you're saying is.
I
we're
think staff
focusing-
is immersed in that, and I think it's partly just as we have the discussions at our level,
We need to tie
in
it
the public
together.
meetings, et cetera, that we're just kind of pausing a few beats to connect some of these dots, partly as we're thinking about policy, and then partly, to Terry's point, at the level at which like the community is having opportunity to connect these dots too.
All right.
Is there anything else that you need?
We just had, yes, we have two, kind of last one. One, we did have some discussion about the idea of performance measures included within the comprehensive plan, and I think, or metrics, I may have called them before. And we shared a draft of, or not a draft, but the performance metrics that are included in Plan Wake County's comprehensive plan, and just wanted to see if there was, confirm there was support for including those types of metrics within the comprehensive plan for Buncombe, that's the direction that we should be following. And again, just to kind of give you an idea of what those metrics are, we recommend, we spent a lot of time in Wake County working on this, and we recommend having kind of a handful or so of metrics, a handful to a dozen, so that you have kind of some clear metrics that you're using to evaluate progress and that you're actually moving the needle on some really important specific things. It could be addition of affordable housing units or, reduction of cost burden households. It could be, lowering vehicle miles traveled. There are a whole bunch of different issues that we could be looking at that support the vision and goals within the plan. And that those would be kind of looked at on a somewhat regular basis, whether it's annual or biannual, whatever makes sense in terms of that reporting, and that be made kind of publicly available, probably to you in a meeting, but maybe also on a website, that sort of thing, so that there's kind of some tracking over time of how the plan as it's being implemented is how it's performing.
And I
One
Yes.
thing sorry.
Yeah, one question with that, and thanks for providing us an example from Wake. And I do think having goals and tracking it is very important. And I wonder how because I know we have some goals around conservation, we have goals around affordable housing. So how do we make sure that we don't have so many, I want to make sure we don't have all these different sets of goals, and then we start getting competing
Agree.
against each other.
Agree, and I think in terms of the performance measures, those are kind of, we have goals in the plan, but those don't necessarily have numbers associated with them. These would actually, these performance measures would have numbers associated with them that could be benchmarked and tracked over time. And the idea would be that we would look at all of your existing kind of ways that you measure in your existing kind of goals and policies and other documents, and that we're starting with that as the baseline, so that we're not kind of, recreating the wheel, and we're making sure that we're being supportive of the ones that you've already established.
Thank you.
That's exactly the point I was going to make, because we are having to play catch up a little bit with the long-range plan, and we're doing some real-time projects. So making sure that we don't do do anything that's inconsistent with those goals. And to someone's point earlier, this provides us with a mechanism to audit this plan. So if we need, since it is a long-range plan, you inevitably will do a few updates before we do a brand-new plan. These are key
Yeah.
in helping us measure what changes that we need to see and that sort of thing. And we have been working very closely with strategy and innovation, because ultimately, we're gonna have a new strategic plan coming up, and then that's the smaller 5-year chunks that influence budget decisions. So I think we're starting to see the beginnings of how all these different planning initiatives come together.
Yeah, I think we've done a really good job with our strategic plan and other plans of really singling out what our performance measures are. And I think that's really important to be able to report back to the community in all of our areas. But finding a way that this streamlines with those others, I agree, is really important. I'd hate to see all this work go into it and then us have no way of knowing if it was successful, or if we were tracking on the right direction of where we wanted to go.
So I see a lot of head nods, so it sounds like we should head in that direction. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I agree, we shouldn't pick 50, we should pick like a few, right?
Right.
That like,
Yeah.
what's most important? That's hard for a group like us, right?
They get diluted. It
But-
starts to be meaningless the more you
Right,
have.
right.
Yeah.
Tracking a few really well is better than having a bunch and just not really being able to focus on all
Yeah.
those things. So how do we select what that short list is? I mean, there's been a few thrown out that, seem, I
Yeah.
mean, certainly some about affordability. I mean, vehicle miles traveled, I'm supportive of that. I don't know if others
Yeah.
would see that, but I don't know, how do we come up with the list?
I think the first thing is look at the baseline of what you've already established. I think those we want to make sure we're carrying forward and being consistent over time with those. And then to kind of, if there are any gaps, transportation or others where you haven't kind of set performance metrics, we could make some recommendations working with staff to identify, a couple things, we want to make sure that it's something we can actually measure on a regular basis without, having to spend a lot of effort to get that data. That's kind of an important thing. Or if there's, or kind of embracing the fact, if that is the exact measurement you want to be measuring, that it's going to cost more to be able to do that. So that's one of the considerations in identifying these is there data available to be doing that on a regular basis? And I think we can make some recommendations that then you all can, and the planning board can take a look at and consider as we're kind of moving through the review process moving forward. I don't know if, I won't kind of jump in any further than that in terms of just like how we might share those, but.
All right. So, I mean, we have a lot of goals, and we do have a lot of different county goals, right? So it's not like y'all have narrowed it down. Like, so do y'all want to come back to us with y'all hear the things we're talking about, here's a suggestion of the 5 or so kind of key ones that we're going to commit to, like, we're going to check on these, we're going to adopt some goals and check on them, and talk about them a lot. And then ultimately, we will put those in this part of the comp plan. Yeah.
And we would want to come back with more than 5, that you can then pick and choose as well. We have some, but we want to make sure we hear back to make sure we're tracking exactly what you want us to track, not just what we think. So,
And just one other thought I would just share about the affordable housing, the affordability piece. I mean, I definitely want to look at the range of different policy options from just, let's bite the bullet, let's do inclusionary zoning, simple, to the things that are sort of getting at it the same way, but not a requirement, but a strongly incentivized kind of approach, types of pathways that we've talked about before. But it does seem like just with the scope of this problem and the housing market that we have, and just like this, I mean, we had a problem, we've had a problem for a while, and then just seeing how much those prices have gone up in a few years, it's just, for all of these efforts we're making right now, it just does seem like we're still going in the wrong direction and it's not a close call, right? So it does seem like, beyond what we're going to be able to do with the resources we have to invest in affordable housing, of which we're, dramatically upping our game, definitely. With all this growth that we're going to see happen in the county, we do need some mechanism to increase the creation of affordable housing through projects that the county taxpayers are not directly putting dollars in, right? Like the projects we put dollars in, they're like all affordable. You know, it'll be like a range of affordability, but they're, you know, those are typically projects where we're partnering with a developer who's, that's what they're doing. It's Habitat for Humanity, or it's, you know, building some multifamily tax credit project, and it's all affordable. It does seem like just for all that kind of the matrix of growth happening beyond what we're involved in, we do need at least some modest percentage of the new housing that's being built to routinely include some affordability, right? And maybe that's, I don't know if that's 5% or 10% or what it is, but if we're not getting something like that, and the only things that we're getting, because right now, if we looked at what we've gotten in the past, if we just kind of looked at past as future, I mean, just unless we're directly investing in a project, we're not getting hardly any. So I would just kind of say that, like, I don't know what the right policy mix is to get there, but it does seem like that outcome is really needed, or for all the investments we make, it won't get better, it'll probably just keep getting worse, is my sense. Any other thoughts before we adjourn for the day? It will be a little bit early. We do have another closed session to go into after this, but any other comp plan stuff while we're got everyone together?
Just thank you to staff
Yeah.
and Paul's team for showing this process. It's really great to be this far along in it.
Yeah, indeed.
Really stellar work, thank you.
Yes.
Been a good partnership.
All right, appreciate y'all. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks. Yeah.